In the Newsy series Teaching Slavery in America, we explore the often misrepresented history of slavery in the U.S. 2019 marks 400 years since history books say 20 and odd Angolans arrived to the British colony of Virginia after the Portuguese kidnapped them, loaded them onto a ship, and sold them to English colonists for food. Their arrival to the New World and that purchase marked the beginning of 2.5 centuries of the enslavement of Black people in North America. The community around Jamestown, Virginia hosted commemoration ceremonies in August 2019. And as I watched them and learned about the significance of 1619, I felt ashamed that it was my first time hearing about it. But I learned I wasn't the only one. Regardless of race, age, or occupation, so many people had never heard about the significance of the year 1619. And it's that fact that led us here. My colleagues and I at Newsy spent months examining how so many Americans were never taught about an event that helped build the foundation of our country. And that question can't be answered until we ask why learn the full, honest story of slavery at all. Newsy's Lauren Maggarino explains the social, political, and economic impact it has on our nation today.
This is the Whitney Plantation, a one-of-a-kind Louisiana museum focused entirely on enslaved Black people. It's described as sobering, a blatant reminder of what so many call a stain on America: slavery. Most Americans learn about the institution in school, an inherently brutal subject where words like Middle Passage, Cotton Gin, and Underground Railroad appear in history textbooks. But on paper, slavery ends in 1865. It's a blip in many textbooks. So why do we still talk about slavery?
You will not replace us! You will not replace us!
Because of the legacy the institution has left behind.
The principal legacy of the institution of slavery that had been around for nearly 250 years is white supremacy.
White supremacy, the belief that the white race is superior to all other races, is interwoven into the fabric of the United States, economically, politically, and socially, post-emancipation.
Slavery is the origin of this country. It is where things begin.
It's the fact that the median white family has 41 times more wealth than the median Black family. Employers choosing resumes with white-sounding names over those with Black-sounding names. It's banks and individuals discriminating against Black American homebuyers until the Fair Housing Act outlawed it in 1968. White supremacy is the nation's 13th Amendment banning slavery, unless you're a convicted criminal. Black inmates have long outnumbered white inmates, the gap narrowing only in the past 10 years, according to Pew Research. A long-standing silence on the over 4,000 lynchings of Black Americans.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Recently memorialized.
Walk all by ourselves.
While Confederate General Robert E. Lee has stood for over a century. Slavery's legacy is
The reason why you get segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools.
You give me second-class houses. You give me second-class schools.
it was the reason for
the largest demonstration for civil rights in the history of the United States.
More than 1 million citizens found their names stripped from the rolls.
its alleged voter suppression in Georgia, affecting thousands of Black voters, and a court finding racial gerrymandering in North Carolina.
It's shaping sort of interactions with police.
They shot him dead. They shot him dead. They shot him dead. They shot him dead.
The history of this country has shown us that the medical establishment is not to be trusted, particularly when it comes to Black and brown bodies.
Black expectant mothers dying at disproportionate rates compared to their white counterparts. Or
I found it was a 2016 study that looked at medical students and residents and found that they believed that Black people could withstand greater amounts of pain than people of other races.
It's shaping interactions with white folks.
It has nothing to do with their race.
in parks, in sports,
A varsity high school wrestler having his dreadlocks cut off.
in churches,
murdering 9 people,
and homes.
With the murder of Tatiana Jefferson,
Slavery's legacy is why we continue to learn about it.
Nobody alive now enslaved an African American. All right? So nobody is responsible for direct enslavement, period. But if you are white in this world, if you are white in America, if you are a white immigrant or an immigrant who came over and became white once you were here, you have benefited from the privileges that have been bestowed upon you because of the discrimination and enslavement of African Americans. Like, no, you're not responsible for anything that happened in the past, but you are responsible for everything that's going to happen in the future.
And when we know better,
it is incumbent upon you to understand the past so that you can make better choices, more democratic choices, more egalitarian choices about the future.
we do better.
A big reason why people even acknowledged the 1619 anniversary was because it made headlines. That's thanks to the New York Times Magazine. It released the 1619 Project, an initiative including articles, podcasts, and information about American slavery and its implications. I spoke with Linda Villarosa, who contributed to the project, about its importance and how this topic is relevant in her own home. Why is 1619 significant to acknowledge in our history?
I think if what we're saying is a really full and robust discussion of slavery has not happened, and it isn't happening in schools, and it isn't happening overall, yet, 1619 was the year that enslaved people came to America and really started to contribute to all parts of society, including the wealth. And so this country is built on the back of enslaved people, which often doesn't get acknowledged. So that is a reason to look at both the consequences of the years of slavery and the contributions of African American people to our country, past, present, and future.
Do you think the coverage that the New York Times Magazine gave to the anniversary had an effect on how much attention people gave it?
I think people are very hungry to get information about slavery. So when I was growing up, I didn't know really any details about slavery. I knew about the Civil War until I saw the movie Roots on TV. It was on TV special. And so I was shocked that that was true. So then I thought, well, for goodness sakes, by the time my own children go to school, they'll learn about slavery. What they got was a really robust learning about the Civil War and a visit to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which was, more about Civil War. I asked the teacher, how are you teaching about slavery? And so she said, no, that isn't really something we're able to cover. And maybe you should teach the class. So, of course, I'm not an elementary school teacher, so I had to teach my children what they know. But I was surprised that in two different generations, there's still this lack of information about slavery. So one of the things 1619 does is it offers information for teachers, giving them some grounding in how to teach the years of slavery.
What do you hope the impact of the Times' coverage will be long term?
What I hope is that people can learn from it, can sort of reimagine the beginning of our country to include how African Americans have contributed to it and how the institution of slavery, which was free labor, contributed to our great wealth. But also to say it's important to know this, it's important to teach this, it's important to acknowledge this, and it's important that it is understood as part of the story of America.
Villarosa hit on the heart of our series, the assumption that surely we received a better history curriculum than our parents and our kids will get one better than ours. But now we're beginning to see that's rarely the case. I visited a school district in Ohio, credited by the Southern Poverty Law Center with teaching an honest, well-rounded history, to see what it looks like.
We got to get to this point, but it takes people like Lincoln standing up for the enslaved to make sure that this institution goes away. And I love this quote. It says, "Where slavery is, there liberty cannot be. And where liberty is, there slavery cannot be."
Sitting in the back of Justin Emmerich's 8th grade history class in small town Ohio, I tried to remember how many lessons like his I'd heard at 13.
If we want to have a country that is based on freedom and liberty are the same thing, can you have an institution of slavery? 4 million enslaved people in a country that sells itself as being for liberty.
How many times in middle school did I hear a lesson about things as mentally, emotionally, and historically complicated as slavery and race, and have an instructor ask for and care about my interpretation?
Here's what I want. Shove your desks together. Shove your desks together. I want you to go straight to the corroboration page.
Not very many.
You started to see a lot of students start to clam up, and when asked how many times they discussed it, that was maybe the only time for probably more than half of the students they'd ever mention the word.
He introduces his students to the concept of slavery early on in the year.
We're 6-ish weeks in.
Yeah.
Why are we already just laying all this down?
I mean, if you know it and you don't tell them, you're lying to your students.
Is that the truth that no one is willing to say? You're
What truth?
lying to your students if you don't teach this.
I don't know. I think it comes down to almost a lack of respect for your kids when you're shielding it because you're worried about them emotionally. I'm more worried about the emotions of when they're 25 and they find out about it and they feel like they've been lied to.
To remain faithful to history, Mr. Emmerich relies on primary sources like autobiographies and firsthand accounts from novels rather than textbooks, because he says they often portray a slanted reality.
I believe you're actually doing a disservice to those individuals that were enslaved. And I think that I approach this that I want to give them a voice.
And like the images on his walls, he wants the perspectives of the enslaved standing beside, not behind, those who had a voice or those whose voices were the loudest. The Southern Poverty Law Center found most teachers are serious about teaching slavery as accurately as possible. But many states fail to set high content standards to assure it's happening. In the state of Ohio, where Mr. Emmerich teaches, there are only a few requirements. In fact, the word slavery is only mentioned 3 times in the state's nearly 50-page content standards guide, once in 4th grade and another 2 times in 8th grade.
I think we can look at the state standards as things that we have to hit, like that's the bare minimum that anybody should expect that our students deserve.
Dr. Merkel is the district's supervisor of equity. She's constantly reviewing and revising curriculums to make sure they're representative of all communities. And she admits they're still working to fill some gaps in their lessons about slavery, but says ultimately it'll take teachers like Emmerich to highlight what still needs to change.
But we're reading this like an historian. We're questioning everything.
My goal would be for all of our teachers to feel that same level of confidence and preparedness to be able to tackle that with their students, because we know that they can handle it and that they deserve it.
So I wonder, for kids that are in other classes, is there a concern that they're not getting all of that context that maybe Mr. Emmerich's students are going to get?
You know, I think that that's an interesting question. I believe that, all of our teachers are doing right now the best that they can for their students.
81% of the families that make up the small towns that come together to create the Olentangy local school district are white. And they make a median income of $126,000. That's double the state's average of $54,000. So you could argue that this is the least likely place to do a story like this one. But Mr. Emmerich says that is exactly what makes it the perfect place.
I think you have to come with the realization that they're better than we know they are. They can handle more than people believe they can.
It's our history, and we should accept it, and we should learn about it and make sure it does not happen again.
My mom would always tell me, as a black girl in the school, I've noticed that slavery is still going on, or like racism in a kind of way. So I feel like everyone should be introduced by it.
Emmerich will be the first to tell you his lessons didn't always have this impact. But it was a message from Nelson Mandela's grandson, Ndaba Mandela, that made him think.
Because it will allow the kids to understand the true balanced history and not instill the sense of inferiority that history does today.
And I remember sitting in that room realizing that was the same history I was teaching in my class. It was a white male-dominant history.
And that made you feel what?
That I had let down how many years of students, and I had let down many students of color that I had over those years because they left my class believing that they were probably inferior through the history I was teaching. And that is something I can't get back.
But what he wants to make sure his students get is the most American story there is to tell.
And the story of the black struggle in America, that story might be the greatest story of liberty in our country's history. They know what liberty is. They can see it. They know they don't have it. And for them to go and earn it, that's a powerful story.
In part 2, we'll meet the man who helped the Olentangy Local School District revamp its curriculum and learn why he doesn't want them to lean on textbooks. That's in part 2 of our Newsy original series, Teaching Slavery in America.